Welcome to the third workshop on the Freudian Unconscious. In this third workshop, we're going to be covering two papers from early in Freud's career, basically focused on the phenomenon of forgetfulness and also the phenomenon of screen memories. Both of these papers are, I think, conceptually linked and give us a deep insight into the usefulness of paying attention to very small details in our everyday life, and the way in which paying attention to very small details in our everyday life can lead to enormous discoveries with huge, potentially even universal consequences. So for this lecture, actually, I have decided to go with a PowerPoint presentation because I think it might be a better way to communicate the essence of the papers, and then we'll go into a collective discussion with the people who have joined me here in the live. So I'm going to share my screen and let's go into these papers. If you can see there, we're discussing the first paper called The Psychological Mechanism of Forgetfulness. Published in 1898. This paper is basically exclusively focused and interested on the phenomenon of forgetfulness. So you see here that Freud is interested often in the opposite of knowledge. He's interested in forgetting, interested in the absence of knowledge, or the failure of knowledge, or the inability to recall knowledge. And that obviously separates him from typical scientific and even philosophical pursuits in terms of focusing on an absence, focusing on a certain negativity. In terms of this phenomenon of forgetfulness, the interesting thing, and one of the, in my view, geniuses of Freud's work, is that he focuses on a very common everyday phenomenon, which it should be familiar to all of us, which is forgetting a proper name. So he says, quote, who doesn't relate to or recall the phenomenon of being in the middle of a conversation and admitting that one cannot hit a name? And this being coupled with a type of feeling of irritation. So if I was to be in conversation and I'm just trying to name that book that I read last night or that book that I read last week and trying to communicate it, but the name of the person slips my mind, or I meet someone and I, was telling them a story about someone I know and the name slips my mind. I think this is a phenomenon that almost everyone has experienced. It's a type of universal phenomenon. And this strikes Freud as a particularly interesting psychic bug or psychic, mystery that requires deeper attention. And he goes into this phenomenon. So the paradox he immediately identifies is that when one has lost or is unable to recall a name, that the paradox is that if you put intentional, deliberate attention and concentration onto this lost name, like you try to focus on the lost name, that it doesn't come to your mind, that it continually eludes you. The more you focus on the lost name, the more it will elude you. You can't bring it up. So the crucial thing here is that the ego, or our conscious attention, is powerless to find the lost name. And oftentimes, he says, there will be a substituted false name, but you quickly discount it. So you're trying to recall the lost name, a different name comes into your mind, but you quickly discount that it's not that name. So as is, I think, common knowledge now, the best procedure to find the lost name, and I think this is even folk knowledge, is precisely to not think about it. In other words, to not use your conscious attention, to not use your what's in your ego's control, and you basically shift your ego's attention to something totally different. And he says that when you do this, the paradox is that the missing name shoots into your mind. It could be in 5 minutes, could be, you leave the conversation and all of a sudden you're not thinking about it anymore, and then the name comes. And it just here, he's clearly here starting to identify the matrix of unconscious ideas and the way it works, and also is bringing to our attention the powerlessness or the impotence of our ego image, and showing the ways in which in everyday life this is manifesting. So his explanation for this is basically the mechanism of repression. So he says, the topic intimately bound up with the topic, which the lost name is intimately bound up with trains of thought which were in a state of repression in me. And from this, he gives in this paper a really interesting description, and I think a really precise technical description of how repression works. So let's go into that. He says that repression, and here you start to see the beginnings of the model of the mind, where you have id, ego, and superego. So you have and here all are operating in the function of repression. So you have, on the one hand, an intensity of interest, and that would be obviously the id. Then you have this meeting with resistance, which is the function of the superego. And that this double process, the intensity of interest plus the meeting with resistance, the id and the superego, prevents the ego, basically, or what he calls the psychic agency, from being able to identify the word or the name. And in the paper, he actually has a diagram and a model of repression and how it works. And in his particular example, I think it's interesting that he says the best examples of conscious repression are issues related to sexuality and death. And you see here how in Freud's model of the mind and his approach to human beings, this the double problem of sexuality and death are already present in his mind. So, we already see the seeds for what will become basically the life drive and the death drive. He also starts to more clearly identify that by getting at the functioning of repression, we see how psychoanalytic therapy works, because he says that the inner repressed tension between this intensity of interest plus the meeting of resistance, which prevents the psychic agency from functioning properly, basically, or being able to do what it wants, is the discovery or the communication of the correct name or word by the analyst. So the function of the analyst is basically to receive the frustrated speech of the subject and to either through their receptivity help the subject themselves stumble upon, as it were, the correct name or word, or identify the correct name or word. A very skilled analyst will be able to sort of identify and speak in the correct place where the subject is stumbling or fumbling around. And this is the crucial mechanism here in the talking cure or the talking therapy, which is that when this word is discovered, the symptoms which were the product of the missing word reinstantiates a genuine psychic object. So as it relates to sex, now, when you see how he goes very deep to the core of the human psyche, just from this very simple mechanism of forgetting, not being able to recall a certain word, and then generalizes it to a much broader psychic mechanism and functioning at work. And you could imagine here that many people struggle with both their libidinal life and, you might say, also their mortidinal life, precisely because they don't have the ability to understand the complex mechanisms of repression which are at work and which are forming contradictions for the subject's ego. And this is why, the psychoanalytic method basically is so important to confront those most intimate dimensions of our life. So that's that paper. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, and we can get into a conversation. So I know for me on a personal level, I've often had this problem of, or had that experience of, being in the middle of conversation and really wanting to describe a certain phenomenon I was excited about, and not being able to recall the name. And the more I focus on it, the more I try to recall the lost name, the more it eludes my grasp. On a deeper level, when I think about symptoms of my identity, which are really frustrating to me on a very intimate level, like related to sex and death, I have found that when I find the right word, as it were, a lot of the symptoms of my relationship to these problems can be relieved. A certain tension or a certain contradiction can be, reduced. And I can work again with a more, what he calls a genuine psychic object. So if any of you have, want to jump in, let's talk about it.
Well, yes, in this paper, Freud explicitly gives us the strategy for how to recall things. Well, if you don't remember something, you just consciously choose not to think about it. You put it aside for a moment. Mm-hmm. And I think that Freud makes very interesting comments about the common and concrete strategies that one can use to memorize things. I mean, there are lots of different strategies that one can apply in studies and in trying to memorize some pattern or
it makes me think, when I try to take this very almost banal example of, you're in a conversation with someone and you forget the name of an author you want to talk about or something like that. But when you take that example and then you bring it to more serious dimensions of life.
I mean, I would like to latch on to this point. Is it this like really crazy statement? I mean, he goes nuts when he makes this connection, don't you think? I mean, this is some kind of crazy nightmare for somebody who would be really immersed into the ideology of scientism, rigorous scientific methods. You cannot do any universalizations from particular cases. I mean, this is a nightmare. And I mean, don't you think that it's a crazy statement for one to universalize that like that?
Yeah, well, I think that is often what the resistance to Freud is that he finds he seems to, so the way he frames his discourse is that he's discovering things of universal significance from these seemingly idiosyncratic, particular, raw material of day-to-day life, and I think that is something that usually the scientific materialist would object to,
Yes, and he actually has some firm basis in his concepts, since he actually undertakes the process of defining his clinical concepts, which is not something that is as common in practices today as one would perhaps expect, but yeah. I must put for one the concept of displacement. I mean, is it Verschiebung or something like that? I mean, he has these constants in his theory.
Can you go into that a little bit?
I mean, the
displacement. Displacement related to displacement and displacement related to this mechanism of substitution.
Yeah. I mean, he says that on page 482 that there is displacement and repression at play in the phenomenon that he's inquiring into in this paper.
Yeah, so I guess the universal mechanism he's identifying here is...
Yeah, and if I would like to also connect it to the fact that these are things that he teaches in his later lectures from like in very late life, he does these introductory lectures, and these are things that are constantly present in his writings.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the germs of these later ideas. So like that's why I was so fascinated by the graph or the figure, sorry, that he uses in this paper, you know, specifically related to, you know, this repression of sex and death, because you see sort of the germs of, you know, these two concepts being central for, you know, the way he sees the human mind. Also concepts like you're saying, displacement and substitution. These concepts later get really worked out and fleshed out in much deeper ways, obviously. I also like I want to emphasize the everydayness of the observations. Like I like at the beginning of the paper how he makes the comment about how in the culture he was in and the people he was around, he gives the, you know, the common sort of, you know, the phrase, for example, that he says, these people claim that if sex comes to an end, life has no value. You know, like this, you hear people joke about that all the time. Like people saying, you know, people joke like about men, if men lost their penis, that they wouldn't even want to live, you know, like, but just that he's making this almost, again, like banal everyday example that people say, but it seems to me to be quite profound, because if you think about the scientific universe, and I think about contemporary scientific debates even, you know, they struggle to understand where value comes from. But you see right here in the common everyday speech of the people that if sex comes to an end, life has no value. It loses all. So where does the value come from? The value comes from the erotic drive. That's where your value's coming from. And then the mechanisms of sublimation. Just to unmute yourself there, Roshana.
Sorry. Exactly, the second bit. So the drive and its sublimation.
Yes.
So it's the dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
And so all these defense mechanisms, or all this sublimation, compromise, formation, all of these are the resultant of this tension. You talked about that in your presentation, the tension. Absolutely. So what you said, Mika, about the scientific sort of method, it's not dialectical, it's just linear. Right. You just go forward. Nothing pushes against it. Well, actually, maybe when things don't work out, you know, when your hypothesis can't be established, you sort of go, okay. Huh. So maybe in a kind of a way in the scientific method you go but yeah, Freud, as you said, outlines the whole kind of, Yeah,
I agree. It's not dialectical, but it's not ironical either. Would you agree? I mean,
it's not ironical.
It's not self-consciously ironical or trying to be any kind of funny.
No, but I think, look, I think science is interesting. I think there are ways in which you can do science that's not so deterministic, you know, or you, like, I actually think, I think, basically in psychology it's terrible. It's so opposite of Freud.
Absolutely.
So it's so I can share this quickly. I've got a patient who's really, really hysterical at the moment, and really, really agitated, and really anxious, and totally agitated. He's real hysteric. And so I'm kind of using my kind of approach, which is, to sit with and hold the tensions. The psychiatrist thinks he should have CBT and has rung me and told me I am not to do psychodynamic psychotherapy with this person because, and he's so agitated that he's going, okay, the CBT is it? Give me CBT. And I'm thinking, well, anyway, so that's an example. Like, and I think it's a psychiatrist's agitation. So the patient's agitated, the psychiatrist is agitated, CBT. We want the agitation to stop.
Yeah. Right. So
are they like trying to do their homework? They're trying to be nice little children who follow the rules.
Well, it's that, but it's also about stopping anxiety, stopping the provider clinician's anxiety, the fantasy of CBT. I think we talk about this. CBT is a fantasy, actually. It's a short circuit.
Yep. Sounds like a genre of dance music or something.
Yeah, yeah.
We were joking earlier that these labels that they come up with, they sort of like sound like some kind of mystic symbols, like Om symbol for Buddhists, or something like trying to calm oneself down with some kind of mantra.
Yeah, it's a bit like a, worry beads or something, maybe. But yeah,
I think this. I think, well, in terms of your experience in analysis and therapy here, Roshanik, it seems like the scientific mind doesn't want to deal with the dialectics of transference and countertransference, and that you're in the sort of process, and that this process does involve confronting anxiety, and that is not just the patient's anxiety, but also the anxiety and the maturity of the practitioner. And
sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, just that there's this way in which the subjective attitude or the subjective disposition of the professional here does have an effect on what mechanism or what method is seen as, useful, as it were.
Well, that's right, because it's contagious. You see, anxiety is contagious. Transference is what it is. It's actually really transference. So the even hovering attention that Freud proposes is a way of holding anxiety, where it is. And yeah, as you said in your talk, it's about kind of uncovering or allowing the patient to uncover. But I think you're right. I think it's hard to sit with anxiety, and clinicians, and also this is where power comes in, and Foucauldian ideas of the clinician kind of, or the doctor or the psychologist or whoever has the power, so tells the patient, you got to go and do your homework and keep telling yourself that your thoughts, keep taking the negative to the positive. And so the patient goes, okay, but none of it is engaging with them with all of this, that what this paper is about, which is the tension between the drive and what's pushing against there is
and from your story there, I feel like one of the things that's increasingly being brought to my attention is the subject of science always presumes that they have the knowledge that the subject needs, whereas in psychoanalysis, you assume that the subject already has the knowledge. They need to find their own knowledge. Like in this example, like the subject has the word that they need, but they just are struggling to find the word because of the internal mechanisms of repression which are going on. So it doesn't help the subject for you to force the knowledge in your head onto the subject. It's all this problem, I feel, of the scientific subject wanting to have the knowledge as opposed to, being a lack and helping the subject find the knowledge that is unconscious.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. Yes.
What I think is so interesting, that it's not only the right word, but it's also the right word at the right time. I think that's important to say also. And because it could also be totally traumatic. It could be way too traumatic. It would be the right word, but the wrong time, and you don't know what could happen. I guess that's why it's also a very high responsibility as a psychoanalyst, and you can totally traumatize someone because you're working with the anxiety on an intimate level instead of actually forcing some colloquium, some schemas on some person. But I want to ask a question about I found this very interesting, like the genuine psychical object. What is that? Because when I read Freud and psychoanalysis, what I get every time is, okay, we're in this universe of substitution, symptoms, repression, superego, energies. And then we have some authenticity, like, do we believe in it or not? And this could be a huge pitfall, maybe. So yeah, I wonder how you guys think about that.
Mika or Roshanik, do you have an idea about that?
Yeah.
I wonder if the authenticity is that maybe tension. Sorry, Mika.
Yeah, you go ahead if you have some clinical.
No. I was just going to say the authenticity is being able to hold the tension, being able to tension or being able to
Freud,
hold not knowing.
Yeah, Freud speaks here of the tension, but I was about to make some kind of philosophical intervention here, and maybe perhaps try to see what is the kind of philosophical justification for some opposing views here. Maybe one could perhaps bring in Aristotle here and say that, Aristotle says that it would be absurd for us to possess some kind of knowledge without us being aware of possessing knowledge, because Aristotle makes so strict and big requirements for his concept of knowledge. But maybe the kind of knowledge that we are dealing with here is somehow a different kind of knowledge. It's, as Freud says, he thinks of memory as a kind of an archive that one can open up and then go into perceptions about past times. And he says that the secret of hysterical amnesia, which is another issue here, the hysterical amnesia is uncovered when we say that the hysterical people are subjects that do not know what they do not want to know. So there is a desire not to know about certain issues, and but Freud literally affords certain kind of knowledge that is not anything that Aristotle would recognize as knowledge per se. Whereas I think that in Plato it might be a bit different. But
well, it seems to me that the type of knowledge that at the really deep foundations he's talking about is the knowledge of life and death of the individual subject, almost on the deepest level. And it could be that, I don't know, I haven't read Aristotle deeply enough to say, but it could be that Aristotle's knowledge is a type of, I would say, sterile big other, or conceptual framework without connection to the real knowledge of life and death, eros and thanatos. I'm not sure if I'm stepping over I don't know if I'm making some ridiculous claim.
Well, the Aristotelian master term is universal structures of reality, and he divides reality into matter and forms. That's his basic baseline, the very bottom line of his philosophies. Actuality and potentiality. So that he basically thinks that every philosophical problem that relates to change is explained with 4 causes, but the basic framework in which he thinks that everything exists is in material and formal. Those are the 2 terms. So yeah, he basically doesn't concern too much about issues that have to do with intersubjectivity and.
Right, that's what I meant by sterile big other.
And he also, I think that he is pretty similar. The one philosopher I would definitely most closely put with Aristotle is Edmund Husserl from 20th century. I think that Edmund Husserl's transcendental idealism would be most close, because it is totally non-hysterical. It is totally non-ironical.
Right.
It contains no self kind of consciousness about
paradoxical self-reference.
It's all propositional content.
Right. Right.
So Mika,
go for it, Rashanik.
So Mika, where does then the awareness of, you said something about Aristotle talks about knowledge and the awareness of knowledge. Where does that awareness sit?
Well, he basically thinks that when we have done enough logical exercises in academy, and then we reach a place where we can organize our pieces of knowledge with a rational means, which, I mean, we have to remember about Aristotle. Aristotle invented basically science of logic as such. It didn't exist before Aristotle. So he thinks that when you do enough of his scholastic exercises in logic, then you reach a state where you can organize pieces of knowledge. And then you have surpassed experience and you have a universal. He divides experience into perception, thinking, belief, memory, and then after experience, which is this empiria, there comes universal knowledge, which is knowledge of whole.
Right. So ultimately, not a regular subjectivity, but almost an ideal or an objective subjectivity, where subjectivity that's kind of not being like a subjectivity in its ideal, or not this subjectivity. It's subjectivity.
Really idealized. People today assume that the kind of scientist who would possess the knowledge that Aristotle thinks that knowledge is, he would have to possess pretty much every method in every science. But that's obviously absurd.
Yeah, it does sound absurd to me. And just thinking about like the difference between Aristotle and Freud, even though they started with the same problem, like they come to radically different conclusions. And maybe this distinction you're making between matter and form, I think that for Freud, this is fully situated in embodied context and the tensions of the body's own form, if it were, as it were. Like the knowledge that Freud's working with is the matter and the form that Freud is working with is like the tension between the material body and the form of the body, which is an idea. If that makes sense. And in that sense, like the knowledge which he's wrestling with is always a knowledge of the libidinal and the mortidinal dimension of the body, because obviously the body is impotent, mortal, finite. Going back to like the way I'm thinking about matter and form here is kind of like Lacan's specular image, like where you have the impotent baby and you have the form of the image, which is holding this impotence.
Yeah, Lacan makes a really funny comment about the philosophical form. He basically says that it's the same as a balloon. It's inflated ball that surrounds something with emptiness.
That's it. Sorry. Yeah, that's it.
It's a bag.
Yeah, I would like to give more attention to Dimitri's question here of a genuine psychical object, because I think it's a good point. So here what Freud says is his aim of an analysis basically is connecting the repressions and displacements, and which removes the symptoms by reinstating the genuine psychical object. What I take that to mean is that in the obsessional neurosis, the subject is obsessed with an object which has nothing to do with its real problems. It's like, for example, I don't know if I told the story before, but like, well, maybe I'll give the example of I think it's a good way to understand the phenomenon of the SJWs or the woke culture, where they're obsessed with certain ideas which are very far removed from their actual bodily existence, or even the contemporary ecology movement. When you're concerned with these very big global abstract ideas, or even communism, you're concerned with these big, very global ideas and you're obsessed with them and you won't think about anything else. But they're very far removed from this quote unquote genuine psychical object. To me, a genuine psychical object is an object which is actually problematizing your day-to-day existence, and that you can actually bring this to your consciousness, and that you can speak about it with maturity and authenticity, which Freud does say in a paper we covered in the last workshop, is essential for approaching communal problems of, the claims of our sexuality, being able to talk openly and honestly about our sexuality and our own fears of mortality, our own fears of external otherness, basically. So if we don't deal with these weird buildups of repression, then we get lost in these ridiculous problems which have absolutely nothing to do with our real day-to-day life. Like I remember, I don't know, I guess I tell the story of, there was this one young woman who was giving a presentation about endangered animals, and she was talking about dolphins, and she started to break down crying about dolphins. And we were like, why is she crying? Like, what's going on? There must be something else going on. And then we got to know her more over the course of a week. And we found out that she was actually involved in a polyamorous relationship, which was purely contradictory, and she didn't know how to deal with it. And that was really her problem, which had no solution. But through talking about the real of her life, we were able to get her to identify a genuine psychic object, which actually was affecting her life. And I'm sure the image of the dolphins was, sympathetic, but not enough to evoke this extremely, extremely depressive attitude.
She's the dolphin.
Yeah, in a sense. And when you think about the other, ecological or social activists, whatever they're concerned with, really they're getting obsessed with a disingenuous psychic object, you could say. That's not to say that one could not be a genuine activist, but to be a genuine activist, I think the precondition to be a genuine activist is to have done a deep level of self-work, so that you actually have a psychic universe which can confront deep problems outside of your own basic libidinal and mortidinal issues, which is possible.
That's such a great point, Kadal, because I am for a few years I've been in activist circles. I've met a lot of activists, gone to demonstrations. So being introduced to psychoanalysis and all of this, I'm seeing more and more this symptomatic, disgenuine kind of activism, it's really, I can call an example right now what's happening in the Netherlands. It's that basically there's pedophiles here, of course, and people are lynch mobs are actively going on WhatsApp and trying to get old people to, respond. So they attack the person, and they recently killed a 70-year-old man because he chatted to one of them, and he thought it was a 15-year-old girl or something. So this is totally disgenuine, right? They have problems in their own lives, probably sexual problems, and they just get this old man as an abject. And of course, pedophilia is a very real traumatic problem. But this is how they're going along with it. And it's really scary, because in woke culture, this is so huge too. It's the lynch mob, everyone's jumping on it, moralizing. And I think it's actually that this moralizing is what you can see in, regards to sexuality all the time. We don't talk about pornography or masturbation.
Absolutely.
And it's this constant moralizing about it, which, yeah.
So I actually have a formula that I came up with last night when I was talking. I had a private conversation with a friend, and we were talking about this woke culture in the psychoanalytic context. And my formula is that the woke culture is enacting a type of false Puritanism or a disingenuous Puritanism, and what they're covering up is their own fetishism. They won't talk about their fetishism, and they're covering it up with Puritanism. But honestly, the deeper you go into this, honestly, the more uncomfortable it gets, because the level at which people are unable to confront their own pathos, which is like, I liken this, like to revisit this idea in this paper where he says, you know, if there's no sex, then all life loses its value. So like people get their value, and then the sublimation of that value from basically confronting their real pathos. So you have to confront your pathos, your authentic drive, and then you have to sublimate that in a way that makes sense in your local life world. And if you don't do that, then you can easily become this sort of puritanical, ridiculous figure, which is absolutely divided inside and is unable to confront the deep problems of your own tensions, and you become increasingly obsessed with this disingenuous object.
Yeah, totally. Like the level I've seen this gone at, to give a funny example, is a woman who is like, I hate white men so much. I hate them so much.
This is happening more.
I love to have sex with them, but I hate them so much. So she's like attracted to men and hating them at the same time. It's totally
ridiculous. I sympathize with her because I hate myself too. But yeah, you know, I always believe that polyamory is an ideological hoax. You know, like Trump says that coronavirus is a Chinese hoax, then I think that polyamory is the kind of real substitute. But myself, I am just entirely about the audible, like, you know, old-fashioned repression and norms. But I think that don't we think still have something to learn from the, you know, the woke people who are awakened to the real of enjoyment, and we should be probably more inclusive. We should be I don't know. We should be more indulging in real and express ourselves all the time, like make ourselves into some kind of jokers. You know, that Joker film, the guy from the Joker. We should be like him, expressing ourselves freely and be free spirits. And I don't know. We should learn from them, probably. Don't you agree?
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Dimitri.
I think so. I think, of course, but I think the problem with the left right now is that we've gone through the 20th century and these movements have basically failed, even though I think there's still a lot of value in the, you know, socialist experiments. Like the Cultural Revolution is very interesting and also related to sex, because how did they deal with sex in the Cultural Revolution in China? And what they did is they basically repressed it. They said, no, we don't talk about sex. So this is I don't know, it would be very cool if we could read about, you know, advances in that, because there were like feminist advances in the Cultural Revolution too, even though it was hugely catastrophic and there were, you know, the weirdest irrational conflict between divided subjects. But yeah, I think the problem of the left right now, like destroying the statues and all of this, like I support destroying statues. I think, you know, colonial statues shouldn't have to be, you know, we shouldn't look up to these colonial statues. But at the same time, this is all symptomatic behavior. It's all negativity. It's all destructive. And like, this is the problem of the left. We have to build something up and not destruct. It's quite easy to destruct things, you know, it's
basically like Death Drive embodied. Just Death Drive.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I don't want to get too much into the politics of statues and stuff like that. I think it takes us pretty far removed from the topic. But I do think, of course, we have a lot to learn from woke culture. I'm not simply just a reactive, you know, reactive traditionalist conservative or something that that reduces the woke culture to simply a straw man. I think precisely we should engage with woke culture from the perspective of pathos. And we should engage woke culture from the perspective of pathos because there's a genuinely new type of sociality which we can, and a new type of identity which we can discover from revealing this split subject of the woke, that the woke culture is held together by this split subject. And ultimately, we do enter a totally different libidinal territory, I think, by doing this. So there's a lot to be learned. I just want to, before moving on, say that, I think it was really interesting that at the end of this paper, Freud said, he gave this example where this pure state of absent-mindedness coincided with knowing. So he said, in a pure state of absent-mindedness, he said, quote, I knew without a moment's hesitation. So here he's also saying that the more you subtract your ego, the less you focus your ego on a certain particular problem, the easier it is for your unconscious to stumble upon the solution and bring it to your attention almost autonomously. So this is again going back to why Lacan might say something like the unconscious is structured like a language, and is sort of possesses a knowledge, a rational knowledge, which is not of the impotent image of the ego's doing, but just that this this cultivating some sort of interesting relationship between the meditative absence and linguistic knowing. That these two opposites are not, as it were, in a eternal conflict, that they're actually, that the meditative absent-mindedness can actually coincide with a deep linguistic knowing. I thought that was...
That's really, really well put, and I totally agree that this was really interesting bit at the end. Really nice meditations. Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next paper, because the next paper is super interesting and hopefully builds on what we've already here achieved by focusing on this paper on forgetfulness. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll get into it. So the next paper, called Screen Memories from 1899, Freud here notes that he's focused specifically on hysterics and neurotics, and this brings us back to his classical original object, you could say, which is the symptomatic subjectivity in the extreme situations of extreme hysterics and neurotics. He says that what unifies these symptomatic subjects is that they hold fragmentary recollections of memories from earliest childhood. And these fragmentary recollections are just basically incomplete images of events from early childhood, which seem to be, as we get into, kind of innocent and mysteriously innocent. The reason why he brings this as an important observation is because he says, impressions from early childhood are of, quote, great pathogenic importance. So again, going back to the importance of understanding the pathos, understanding the pathic drive, and the pathic drive is somehow deeply related to the value and capacity to sublimate and become an adult and so forth. And that the fundamental difference between children's psychology and adult psychology is that adult psychology has to deal with sort of the buildup of memory. And the child is somehow freed from this problem. They don't have a buildup of memory, that they have to sort of carry around with them. And that this buildup of memory exerts an imagistic force on the subject, which will have an effect to the end of their life. It can have a determining effect on the subject's life. And this is incredibly important if we're thinking about what does real psychic freedom mean, or mental freedom mean for adults, and how adults can be thrown around by their childhood images without even knowing that this is happening. Kind of back to the first paper about the hypnotic type of images and the hypnotic type of consciousness, which we all start in as infants. He says that the problem here is on a double level, which is that the images from early childhood are mostly indifferent events, which do not arouse any deep emotion, whereas the events which arouse the greatest emotion are mostly forgotten, or the subject cannot recall them. And we're going to get into why this is, because the key to understanding screen memory is found in this distinction between early childhood memories of indifferent events. I have so many childhood memories of indifferent events, of why did these that seem to be totally, I don't know what to say, totally irrelevant. Why those were remembered, and events of that arouse great emotion being more difficult to recall. So he here tries to define screen memories as partial experiences on the one hand, and this goes back to the double mechanism in repression that we covered in the last paper, with the id and the superego, of this drive to bring something to attention, and on the other hand, this resistance to this being brought to attention. So you see here the very precise mental model he's using. So on the one hand, you have these partial experiences, which are indifferent in themselves or innocent in themselves, but they are striving or seeking to be remembered for some other purpose, for some other motive, for some deeper motive. And then on the other hand, you have this force of resistance, which is preventing the full scene from being shown. So there's just these partial scenes, I have images in my head of being on the porch with my parents, or being in the forest in a wagon. They're just these flashes of memory, but you don't know, but they seem to be indifferent. They seem to be totally, arbitrary. He says that this double mechanism of this memory is a persistent tension and a compromise between two forces, where the original psychic content is substituted with an innocent memory. So in other words, the original psychic content is something that aroused strong experience. The original psychic content is something that was powerful, something that was related to hunger, or it was related to love, or it was related to fear, or it was related to some trauma. But that this original psychic content is not something which the ego can access. And instead, the only thing the ego can access is some weak, indifferent image, which is merely a pointing towards the deeper affect. So he says here to conclude that that this screen memory is concealing both true experience and wishes or desires. So, as I said already, the childhood memories are of special interest because they leave traces on us, which have an effect on our whole future. So and we go into the type of weird and interesting psychic temporality which Freud is identifying here, because it's not simply this linear notion of past, present, and future, but it's type of a past which is being manufactured in the present moment. So it's the past in Freudian psychoanalysis is something that's very much active in the present moment. It's a present past. And it's a constructed past. And that leads him to speculate on the nature of conscious memories in general. And I think that he makes a very interesting distinction here between the experience in itself, where the subject was an actor or in the middle of a deep situation. So, for example, if you had something traumatizing happen to you when you were 3 or 4 years old, you were in the middle of the situation. You were experiencing the in itself of that situation. And then when you have the memory in itself, this is, he says, quote, you're a subject as an object among objects. So you're a recollecting subject. So you cannot basically recreate the experience in itself. The experience in itself is always this weird recollection where you are now a subject, not in the middle of a situation, but a subject as an object among objects. And this type of ontological dimension of the psychic memory is a fundamental barrier to us from basically having any actual understanding of our childhood. Any actual understanding of our childhood it's impossible, basically. You only have access to your recollected, constructed memories of the past. And here's the interesting thing, is that he says these memories are not complete inventions, but they are formed in the present moment with motives that are absolutely unconcerned for historical accuracy. So in other words, when we construct memories of our childhood, we're not concerned about the historical accuracy of the memory. What we're concerned with is the motive of a certain libidinal tension, or the motive of a certain existential anxiety, as it were. So with that being said, let me stop sharing my screen. And and get into this paper, because I really love this paper, and I have so many experiences from my early childhood where I have these indifferent images, and when I've gone deeper into these images, there are quite traumatic events associated with them. So, for example, I have this image in my head for a long time of being in the forest in a wagon with my father, and I just like a flash. And then when I go deeper into the image, actually, I remember that I remember my father was pulling the wagon really quickly, and it went over a bump in the path, and I fell out of the wagon and smashed my head on the forest floor, for example. But like, this would be an example of the screen memory pointing towards some deeper traumatic issue. I also have a weird memory of being on a porch with my parents in the summertime. And the deeper I went into the memory, I realized it was my father had given me, as a trick, had given me his beer to taste. And I remember tasting this beer as a little child and being absolutely repulsed by it. But this was like a horrible memory, like a horrible experience, the first time having beer touch my mouth. But this is the type of thing he's getting at here. And of course, things can get really traumatic. Like, I've had analytic sessions with people where they stumble upon a screen memory of violent abuse or even sexual abuse, where they have this memory which is innocent. They have this memory which is seemingly indifferent, say, for example, being at a fair or being in a barn, and then actually realizing, oh my God, I was abused. And that innocent memory had been pointing towards and at the same time blocking access to an extremely violent trauma. And this is when you're practicing as an analyst, these are the types of extremely disturbing experiences that a subject can stumble upon in their own willingness to dive into their own history, as it were.
Yeah, and I also would like to comment here that I really love the fact that Freud also identifies the systematic reason for us not to pay attention to these issues. He says in page 491 that the reason for this neglect may very well be in our mental life, so far as it is the object of our conscious internal perception, shows nothing of these processes apart from instances which we classify as faulty reasoning and some mental operations which aim at producing a comic effect. So he's saying that the fact that we pay too much attention to conscious internal perceptions we take them as granted. We tend to neglect also in our, basically also in our, probably in our like professional life also, the kind of faulty segment. So what I was instantly reminded of is this is exactly the same in Nietzsche also. Nietzsche also recognizes this as the major fault for why he thinks that psychology before him did not advance to any depth. So Nietzsche says in like his Beyond Good and Evil that the philosophers before him did not dare to enter into psychology really, because they were too afraid not to make a mistake, or they basically the name of the book is Beyond Good and Evil. Why? Because Nietzsche says that we have to traverse morality in order to really go into psychology. He says that until now, all psychology has been brought to a halt by moral prejudices and fears. It has not dared to plumb these depths. So isn't this basically the same as in Freud? He identifies the same reason.
Absolutely, and that's one of the famous reasons why Freud didn't read or didn't want to read Nietzsche for fear of biasing his own investigations in psychoanalysis.
I would say that he's a pussy. He should read it and recognize that Nietzsche is the king.
Well, I definitely think that Freud, and hopefully we can get into it in a future workshop, but I think that one of the geniuses and one of the things I loved about reading Freud's 3 essays on sexuality was the way in which he confronted sexuality with absolutely no concern for morality. Like, I think he confronts, when he talks about things like bestiality or pedophilia, he does not moralize these phenomena. He rather asks, what are these phenomena? He's interested in what they are, instead of just, and Alenka Zupancic makes the point that the real revolution in psychoanalysis, and I would say in Nietzschean philosophy, is that one is freed from moral coverings which would prevent a genuine knowledge of a psychic object.
Say that again.
That Alenka Zupancic makes the point that in the break in Freudian psychoanalysis and also in Nietzschean philosophy is that one is freed from the moral constraints which prevented us from confronting genuine psychic objects. I mean, I think that's really what happens with both of those enormous intellectual interventions in understanding our existential condition, you could say.
Excuse me, I'm just going to have to get my power cord. I'll be back.
Okay.
If there's nothing else, I would like to comment that maybe one of the reasons why these are so neglected issues is that these are really issues that are recollected under the heading of being dubious or enigmatic or somehow mysterious. So it would be easy to, I think, sympathize with the people who do not really want to work with these kind of concepts. And Freud also discusses something like infantile life with regard to our sexuality and neurosis. But I think that this was also, in addition to the previous one, this was a paper that would really be of psychological interest for, I think that probably anyone in psychology would benefit a lot by studying these kind of texts. I mean, we have to remember that Freud is probably considered to be late in his career when he's now only beginning with his real stuff. I mean, he had done really a lot of studies already. But this is revolutionary. I mean, he's really inventive here. He is kind of like an engineer in a sense.
It's really fascinating. The thing that I appreciate the most in this paper is the form of the form of psychic temporality which he's identifying. Because I always hear I always confront these straw man arguments of Freud of saying, you know, he's too concerned with the past. You know, like he's messed around in the past and he's not concerned with the present. You know, he's not concerned with the creative future. You know, but I think that this is just so, like, if you just pay attention to this paper even a little bit, you can't make that claim. He's making this precise, you know, he's even saying that what we're working with in psychoanalysis really has nothing to do with the past. It has to do with the present past. You know, it has to do with the past, which is here now.
Yeah, he says at the end of the paper that, I mean, he revolutionizes in a way the concept of memory when he explicitly claims at the end that the memories themselves are always, they don't emerge, but they are always formed at some point.
It's genius, the last parts of this paper.
Yeah, that's a good dichotomy between emergence and formation. I think that maybe we could learn a lot philosophically in philosophy of mind about these kind of definitions of basic psychological processes.
Let me read this last little bit of the paper because it's worth our attention, I think. He says, do we have any memories at all from our childhood? Memories relating to our childhood may be all that we possess. Memories were formed in the present, and a number of motives with no concern for historical accuracy had a part in forming them. So he here not only denounces this idea that we have access to our actual past, but that the way we form images of our past has more to do with a type of motive in the present, which is again, this future-oriented action. So I think that Lacan obviously understood this 100%. And in Lacan's first papers, talking about Freud's technique, he says that the type of past which is operating in Freudian psychoanalysis is actually paradoxically concerned with the future. And this is, to me, this to me is absolutely of essential importance, because to me, the human mind and the human subject is a future-oriented entity, which is paradoxically has a pathos for the origin. So you see the interesting temporality here, and it's so precise. It's so precise. It's future-directed with a pathos for the origin.
It's really, really inventive.
What do you mean by pathos?
So, like, pathos being like he says in the paper, of pathogenic interest, which is basically of libidinal interest or of a erotic motive. You know, like talking about the action of the libido. So, like, if you think, for example, about the sex act itself, like, let's think about the sex act itself. We could say that's a pathic drive. And let's think about the actual activity of having sexual intercourse, is that what you're doing in that activity essentially is trying to recreate the original scene, and you even lead to the origin of the infant. You lead to the emergence of the new in that act. So you're recreating the origin in the present moment, and ultimately you're being held by images of the past, of returning to the womb. You know, so this is such a, I mean, I think the temporality here and the type of geometry that we have to think here is, you know, different than the geometries which concern the ancients, like Aristotle and Plato. Like when you think about Platonic forms, I think that Platonic forms need to be fully paradoxicalized, or I don't know, like the objects that come to my mind are objects like the Mobius loop or the Klein bottle or the cross cap, you know, these weird objects which have self-referential contradictions internal to them. You know,
is it then quite funny that Freud says that the kind of notion that psychical intensities can be transferred or displaced from one presentation to another, it's kind of like how as bewildering as Greek mythology is, it's that much bewildering actually. He says that this is like Greek mythology appears to normal people. It's kind of that kind of stuff, and he in a funny way then does connect the Greek thinking with his stuff. He says that it's as mysterious as clothing beauty itself with some kind of veil, whereas we, the modern people, presumably think only of a face transfigured by a change of expression. Yeah.
It's super interesting. I think that putting, that's why I think Lacan emphasized that his analysts read the symposium every year. You know,
I think that's funny.
It's also funny, but the putting ancient philosophy, and this is why I think it's so. I mean, I think it's so valuable here to have you, Mika, here, who's an expert in Aristotle. Is
please do not call me expert here.
You have a certain.
It's fucking symbolic castration. I don't.
Okay, fine. Okay, you're castrated. You don't know anything.
God damn it.
But just this. I think there's so much value in reading the ancients through psychoanalytic lens.
Yeah,
you know, I think that there's so much value that can be derived from that activity. I mean, for me, there's so much value in, once you've been through the psychoanalytic training, all of a sudden movies and music and religion and ancient world mythology takes on a totally different meaning. You know.
So Freud is philosophically sound.
The interesting thing is that obviously he hated philosophy, but he hated philosophy probably for the same reasons that Nietzsche's critiquing philosophy. And that oftentimes the greatest philosophers were in a great antagonism with philosophy itself. You know, like great philosophers are in some sense born through antagony with philosophy. You know, and the type of you could say the philosophers we don't remember, which are most philosophers, is philosophers we don't remember are philosophers who were too identified with a certain philosophical school. You know, in order to be remembered as a philosopher, you have to, in some sense, be in antagonism with the whole of philosophy.
But we should also remember that one can be in an antagonism with the philosophy, but basically Nietzsche was an asshole. I think that he really hammers with some really evil shit. Other philosophers get really nailed in his treatments. But I think that he's right on point against some British philosophers. But yeah, I think that there is some anti-philosophy going on in here in a genuine sense. Can you go
into, because I know Badiou and Zizek talk about anti-philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I would definitely connect it with the reason why Freud thinks that these kind of issues that he deals with are neglected by philosophy. It is because philosophers tend to only pay attention to what is available to conscious internal perceptions of the mind.
That's it.
They assume that there is some kind of roof term called the mind, the Lockean kind of tabula, on which I mean, I would connect also Aristotle in this sense. I mean, I think that Aristotle has this kind of like blank state type of mind issue going on. And
yeah, when
Aristotle thinks that there is some kind of like blank pure mind or pure reason in us.
Right. And I think Rousseau also has that view. The tabula
Rousseau
rasa.
is really funny issue, since, I mean, Rousseau did have like a real public psychosis and started writing about himself in like second or third in person. I don't know. But Rousseau is really interesting in this case also, definitely. That's also, maybe we shouldn't connect Hegel's phenomenology of spirits to in any depth here, but I think that one of the key opponents of Hegel's view is, I think, Rousseau, in a sense.
Absolutely.
And I would also like to highlight the fact that I think that Hegel's phenomenology is kind of like instruction book in psychology in a way. And I would definitely connect it more to Nietzsche and this kind of thinking.
Do you think Freud read Hegel?
He didn't,
No.
probably not. And he only references Hegel twice, and it's kind of arbitrary. His references to Hegel are arbitrary. I don't think Freud really read deeply philosophy. Maybe he read some, I mean, I'm sure he read the ancients, but I'm not sure.
He loved like Schopenhauer.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Well, I know.
He's very Hegelian for someone who hasn't read Hegel.
But that's easily possible.
Oh, of course.
It's easily possible to be absolutely. I know so many people who are basically implicit Hegelians. But I think that my view, and I'm biased obviously, because not only am I identify in some sense as a Hegelian, but I'm currently buried in the phenomenology of spirit, is that phenomenology of spirit should be essential reading for all psychologists, and really a precondition to be a psychologist or a philosopher, in my view.
Yeah.
But getting away from the topic a little bit, does anyone have any comments on screen memories and the what Freud's here bringing to our attention?
Yeah, I thought what was very interesting is that when I was reading this, I was constantly trying to think of what I can remember from my childhood. And there's not really much, actually nothing but this dream. I remember when I was 4 years old, I had this dream that my dad was being tortured on the beach. And that I was going to save him because this crab was torturing him. So I was coming with my grandpa to save him. And I don't. When I was 4, I decided to remember that. I know that I wanted to remember it, which is very weird. But basically, what I found interesting is that how similar dreams and screen memories basically are. There's totally, or like the whole mechanism is like totally dreamlike, like the hypnotic state, all these things which are happening. And one thing I didn't really understand is this word he comes up with. He calls it retrogressive. I don't know what he means by that. He says a screen memory may be described as retrogressive or as having pushed forward according as to one chronological relation or the other holds between the screen and the thing screened off. I don't know what he means by that.
So I didn't highlight this in the PowerPoint, but he talks about, quote, reverse screen memories, where the temporality of the screen memory is reversed. So it's basically a oppositional reversal of a typical screen memory. So a typical screen memory would be that there's a childhood event which is covered up with an indifferent image, whereas the type of the retrogressive or pushed forward memory is when a childhood memory is accounted for by later experiences. So basically the future, like a future event, is covered over by past events in some sense. So it's like this reversal. it's like a temporal reversal, but it's very, to be honest with you, it's extremely difficult to conceptualize.
But is it possible that, like, it's not future but present, so there's an experience that's being repressed,
right,
and then a memory comes in from the past in the mind, so I don't know, you think, I mean, yeah. Like
it kind of reminds me of how Zizek describes the way trauma functions in the present and then is retroactively filled in with some childhood memory. Like it could be that you have a sexual problem in the present moment, but you imagine it to be some problem, like, for example, seeing your parents having sex when you're a child. That's the example Zizek gives.
And I would like to say that it's really relatable when Freud gives this example of the professor who has this really severe bereavement going on, and he just remembers some kind of basin of ice laid on a table on some meal. I think that it's really relatable in my view. And he says that this kind of analysis brings us always into similar topics. He mentions fear, shame, physical pain, etc. And on the side of the content, what is the content of these kind of issues that are going on? It's relating to illnesses or deaths of loved ones or kind of fires or births. So yeah, I think that it's relatable and interesting in a way.
Another interesting thing is that in this section, where Dimitri's bringing our attention to this retrogressive screen memory, the reverse screen memory, there's also I think an important distinction that screen memories can both be positive and negative, meaning that what really the screen memory is doing is covering up an excess of affect. That's the crucial thing. It could be a positive or a negative excess of affect. So for example, the example I was giving of my childhood of the first time my dad let me taste a beer, not necessarily that's traumatic, but it's more an excess of affect. Like it was too much. It was an overwhelming experience for me as an infant to taste even like a little bit of beer. So it's just this overwhelming excitation, as it were. And it could very well be a positive as well as a negative memory, but nonetheless, the repression is at work in both cases, and it reminds me of how in Lacanian theory, it's not just missing jouissance, which is the problem, but also an excessive amount of jouissance can also be a problem. So not just that you're not just the lack, but also the excess of the object, which, of course, this brings us to object patia and anxiety, but object patia can also be it can be a lack, and it can also be an excess.
Yeah, it's
which brings us to your points, Mika, about polyamory. Like where if you have an excessive amount of sexual activity, that also can overwhelm your system in a negative way.
Yeah, I agree. And also I would like to go to the philosophical or relating to the history of ideas side and say that the new invention is here, that the bits or pieces of the experience which is not entirely like remembered well, the pieces that are missing are kind of omitted by the subject, that there is some kind of will action going on about not really recollecting everything about certain issues. But we could also bring in the kind of typical notion of unconscious as some kind of what was it, iceberg, 90% is underwater or something. Freud is here probably in a diametrical way opposed to that kind of picture of unconscious, since he thinks that everything is like revealing all the time.
Yeah,
because we just decide not to go into it.
Yeah, Zizek makes this point as well, that the iceberg metaphor is misplaced. That the unconscious should be thought of as more as a fragile virtual surface.
So this paper brings in also the, as you talked about earlier, about the issue of temporality and time. Because in a way, memory, like there is this present moment where I'm conscious, and there is the previous moment and the previous moment and the previous moment. And you make that 50 years of life of, you know, things are going to, it's like we can, our limited kind of capacities to be able to, we can only, like in this moment, things are unconscious. And then this paper is about the unconscious as expressed through time in terms of kind of memory. So what we remember, what we don't remember. In this moment, what I'm aware of, what I'm not aware of. So it's kind of the two axes. And yeah, it's just, human life is amazing. Consciousness is amazing.
Right.
Actually, sorry?
Agree. Yeah, agree.
Yeah. Well, I think it's obvious. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, for me, again, I would just bring my attention to this almost naive form of temporality that usually, of course, science, I think it's like pretty operative in the evolutionary view, where you do have this sort of naive notion of past, present, future.
Yeah.
You know, like, and you're thinking about past, present, and future in a certain, you know, at least it's always framed in a certain way. You know, you have the images of the Big Bang to the present, and it's this linear past which is coming to the present.
Yeah, but shouldn't we also oppose this view to the genuine evolutionary theory from Darwin, since the kind of structures which evolution finds, they are not predicted or they are not predicated on some kind of big other. They are just displaced or separate kind of structures which somehow function, but they are not predicated on any kind of universal substance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to, I think I'm not here trying to deconstruct Darwin so much as I'm trying to approach the sort of the naive ontology of, you know, the way I think our popular imagination imagines the evolution of the universe. And I think that for me anyway, it's really thinking about these constructed histories as operating in the present moment. And what do they say? What do they say about our motive and our future orientation towards the origin?
Yeah, it's this tunnel vision of the universe as some kind of tube.
Right. And I think that what I'm trying to think, you know, tubes that only exist through self-referential paradox.
It's a funny way to put it.
You know.
Just look at us. We're little, we're 3 or 4, and we're kind of 30 or 40. I mean, just same person.
Yeah.
Same person, like, you know. What I loved about this paper was that I don't remember much of my childhood, very little before that, but I had these isolated memories. And I'm very curious what sort of screen memories they are, and what lies behind them.
Or you might not want to know.
The realities that I already know, we already know.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you said this, because I was thinking the same, and then I was thinking, so of course I'm not going to remember anything because I'm putting conscious attention into trying to remember it, you know, to connect it to the last paper. But yeah, I think this is so mind-boggling to me. It's this very Hegelian dimension which I'm still trying to grasp, of this what the present is now, and like the retroactivity and the necessity of the past, because and how that determines our future then, or how the future is already determined and we can only change the past, because the past is not even real, in the sense that, you know, it's always formed, like Freud says. Like, what do we do with this?
It's scary.
Yeah, it's so scary. It's also pretty sad. Like,
since
my memories
everything that
about
we
my
are,
childhood
we might,
are not even real.
Yeah,
I'm
everything that
just
we are, we might just be random accidents or some kind of accidents that have just happened to us, and we don't get to choose them.
Well, I think that in the scientific materialist universe, they definitely are, you know, inscribing an ontology that the universe has a history of accidents. But I think what this misses is that this notion that the universe is a history of accidents is a past which is retroactively posited as necessary, and by them as subjects. So that this retroactive positing of a necessary past is itself, I think, something which Zizek identifies as the potential for liberating, because you can rewrite your own past based on your motive for the future. So and you can liberate yourself because the story you're telling yourself about your past, like, say, for example, you're telling yourself a certain story about your relationship history. Right? We all have a narrative in our head about our relationship history. But that's something which is being retroactively posited as a necessary way to think about our relationship history. And that in itself enslaves us.
Yeah, and it also turns out we weren't that rational in our choices as we expected ourselves to be. So we basically feel a lot of shame because of that. We always fail. I mean, in following laws and so on.
Transgression.
Yeah. So it in a way forces us to be more humble about how much the inner sort of manager of the system can make, or how like potent or how all capable we are.
Absolutely.
Do you agree that we have this common view today about ourselves as sort of manager or entrepreneurs, as some kind of inner managers of all of our actions? We can always choose, we can always change. With every choice we can make ourselves the way that we should be in our own self-image. So I'm basically talking about neoliberalism here.
Yeah.
So tacitly as it is.
Well, I do see, as I'm encountering more Jungians and sort of seeing the way they frame things is they seem to have this idea of building up a strong ego. And when I read Freud and when I read Lacan, of course, the notion of building up a strong ego is kind of it doesn't really hold much weight.
It's a joke.
Yeah, to build up a strong ego is kind of a paradox because the ego is so impotent. Like how Freud ended the last paper saying that it was only in his absent-mindedness where he found the knowledge he was looking for. You know, it's kind of like building up a strong ego is kind of I don't know.
That's pop psychology, which is fed by the system, the capitalist system that wants us to serve it. So in a way, if we're questioning, or if we question ourselves, we're not really good foot soldiers. But I mean, Jung himself talked about individuation, and individuation. I mean, he kind of didn't. You know, he wasn't as kind of philosophically. Although Freud didn't like philosophy, he was philosophically coherent in a kind of a way. or maybe more deeply covering deeper or wider area. But yeah, I think the pop version of, you know, Jungian or transpersonal psychology or all of that is about this idea of being. But yeah, I think it's we need Hegel in psychology.
I'll second that. What I was thinking about with this, the way in which the memory and the way in which our past functions as a retroactive necessity was what I'm learning when I'm doing, for example, men's circles, is, you know, when I tell my own story about what happened in the last week or what happened in the last 2 weeks of my life, I recognize that there's actually a great deal of freedom in how I construct the narrative of what happened to me last week. You know, when I'm constructing the narrative of what happened to me last week, well, like I'm thinking, well, I could structure the narrative this way, and that would be true. I could structure the narrative this way, and that would be true. I could structure the narrative in many different ways, and it would all be true. But what really matters when I'm constructing the narrative of what happened to me last week is what I want to work through as a motive drive right now. So I think that's what it brings me to. It makes me think, when I think about the past, I want to ask myself, what am I trying to figure out right now? And that's how I'll construct sort of my understanding of the past. But I won't think about the past as some objective in itself, you know, like that somehow, you know, has a, you know.
Look, any good therapy or process has to be presently focused. The past can be, yeah, as you said, kind of recalled, but even when you're working with people, like, you don't sort of we'll go and uncover this bit in your past and I give it to you and then you're liberated. No, many people that have been in analysis therapy 20, 25 years have had insight, but no absolute change. It's not about insight, it's about, so, you know, you work, so clinically, you work in the present, in the session. Wilfred Bion said, no memory, no desire. You have to enter each analytic session without any memory of the past and without any desire for what's meant to happen.
Absolutely.
It's basically almost like the yogic state, which they also pursue with different way, because they think that you must rid yourself of some kind of false self-image and some kind of desire.
But isn't that impossible?
It's what you aspire to do, but yes, as you're sitting there, you've got your own thoughts going. I've got to make dinner. I'm so pissed off with this person at the moment, or they're annoying me, and you just got to do like you're meditating, except you're with somebody else. You just got to go, okay, let it go, keep coming back to the present moment. It's impossible in itself. But it's a train you get on, and it's amazing what can happen. I'm not a psychoanalyst, you know, kind of with the paperwork, but I think I am a psychoanalyst because I'm working in this way.
You're a psychoanalyst in our eyes.
Thank you.
We recognize you, Roshana.
Well, you know, I shouldn't need recognition by this time in my life, but
no, I don't know. Like, I always have the fantasy image of being free of any need for recognition, and I've definitely made progress in my need for recognition, but being fully free of desire for recognition, I think, might be, again, holding this impossibility and trying to repeat the impossible.
Well, exactly, because I brought the whole bloody thing up about psychoanalysts. I'm not you know, so I'm giving you the information to say that I'm unresolved about it.
That's right.
You gotta look between the words and the sentences. But yeah, no, that was a really good paper. Thank you.
All right. Is there anything else in this paper anyone wants to really bring to our attention?
Just read it. It's great.
Okay. Dimitri?
Yeah, no, yeah, well, it was a great paper. What can I say?
Okay.
There was a nice saying in there. He made a comment or saying that there is this common saying about shams, that shams are not made of gold themselves, but they have lain beside them something that is made of gold.
Mm.
And he says that the same might be the case in our experiences of childhood that are retained as a memory.
Mm. I know I'll just say maybe, yeah, I mean, that sounds, I mean, there's so many memories I have of my past, which do function as this screen memory, but there's one early memory I have. I think it's my earliest memory. I think it might be even so far back as like before I was 1. And it's just this flash of being in a like a little cot that my mom's holding, and I'm going up this flight of stairs, and it's just a flash. But I can't get any deeper on why that image is my first memory or my first image.
That's crazy, man, that you can remember that.
It's just a flash, like, you know, the further I go back, the fuzzier it gets. You know, my memories only start to become coherent or like larger stories or narratives or scenes when I'm about, like, it definitely intensifies around the year before and the first year of kindergarten. Then my images start to gain more narrative coherence, but but before then there are coherent flashes, you know, and I usually, if I you know, usually in you know, talking about my history, the memories of these flashes do function like screen memories. I've got a whole bunch of stories of weird screen memories. Like, I have this, you know, I remember the first time I saw a horse up close, and it was extremely terrifying for me to see a horse, and it was so grotesque, the horse's nostril. This type of thing. There's so many examples like this. The more I've talked about my history, it's really fascinating. But
you know, I really recently saw an interview with Zizek, and this guy was asking him, like, what is your first memory? And Zizek, basically quite uninterested, was like, yeah, it was snowing in Ljubljana in the early 50s. And then he says that, I think he says this in other places, that he actively tries to forget and repress his childhood, that he burned his photos of his family, and that he didn't care when his parents died. I don't know, man. I'm pretty sympathetic to that, actually.
Myself, I have never thought that any of my earliest memories have any meaning. I just think that they're some kind of random images or flashes. I have this just some kind of memory of sitting in the kitchen and watching outside of the window and sun is shining. It's basically just that. But I don't know. I felt sympathetic to that. Huh?
According to this paper, it's not the case.
I feel mostly sympathetic to the example that he gave about the guy who he only remembers some kind of random flashes, and everything like Precious is only told by the parents or somebody else to them.
I think we're all a bit like that. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Well, I do think in the end, you know, the approach that Zizek's describing is, you know, but, you know, to be, you know, Zizek's example is a good example, but it's also true that Zizek has been through deep psychoanalysis himself. He's been through analysis. So I think
didn't he say that he never terminated, he never made it to the end of the analysis?
I'm not sure about that. That could be true, but
he might have said it.
Wasn't he analyzed by Jacques-Alain Miller?
Yeah, and he compares him to Stalin. And he has this funny joke about the triads of philosophers, you know, like Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, and then he thinks of like, oh, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and then he actually thinks that, well, definitely Freud is like Marx, you know, and Lacan is like Lenin, and then you have Stalin. I mean, isn't it like really arrogant also?
It's funny. But I was just gonna say, there's evidence I can prove this theory because my son, because you know, I videoed a lot of his childhood, and I don't put it on much, but occasionally I put the videos on, and he gets so like, he just, don't put that on. I don't want to see myself, and he runs away. And I'm 16 now. But it is, and I was interested to think, how come he doesn't want to see his childhood? Like, what have we done? Because we can capture everything on film now. So, and you know, I know mothers who've filmed everything. They've got like
it's all in Instagram.
500 hours.
I think it's pure psychosis. Like, I know some people who are like, they're crazy people.
They're crazy, but the trauma of their children looking at these videos.
Yeah.
Like, no screen memory. Forget it. You got the whole thing in front of you.
Yeah, it's really funny.
It's too traumatic.
Well, that does make me think that does give you access to the memory in itself, and then you need the concept of the extended mind, that our mind is actually extended across, you know, material virtuality.
Sure. But what's interesting is my son isn't interested in his childhood because he wants to not remember.
Yeah, but I think I'm sympathetic to your son there. Totally. Totally.
What?
I'm the same when my parents are like, hey, you see this photo? I'm like, I don't want to see it.
Isn't this really connected to the topic of prosthetic God in Freud? I mean, he says that we basically can become like prosthetic gods, that we have these prosthetic organs which we put on, but we do not quite feel at home with them. We are kind of agitated with them, and we basically go nuts. So even though we gain like superpowers with these new devices and everything, we basically are unhappy inside.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me feel really good about myself that I didn't do a lot of filming. I used to feel very guilty that I'm not a good mother. Now reading this paper, I'm thinking, actually, I'm a good mother. I didn't feel so much.
All right, guys. So I think
it's the apocalypse.
All right, let's wrap up. I think this was great conversation. I hope you guys got a lot from these two papers. Forgetfulness, screen memories. Mika, get some sleep, and I'll see you guys hopefully in the next workshop. I'll post this online tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks for this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, have a great night, guys.